So today we'll talk about Adcore's Q1 numbers. As you know, Adcore is a position of mine. I have this stock both in my family's portfolio as well as in my personal portfolio too. So Adcore is very relevant for me. But anyway, as I said, today we'll discuss Adcore's Q1 results. Before we begin, though, as always, nothing in this video is investment advice, okay? And with that said, let's get started. So, starting with revenue. So the first thing I want to bring to your attention is the fact that Adcore is almost breaking its own revenue record. Now, what do I mean by that? So as we can see here, the best year in terms of sales for Adcore was 2021, when Adcore posted 35.4 million Canadian in revenue. Then the company's sales declined, going to only 26.7 million Canadian, but thank God the company started to recover. And today, Adcore is showing 35 million Canadian in sales. So as I said, Adcore is almost breaking its own revenue record. In my view, they will likely soon surpass 2021. They will likely deliver more than 35.4 million Canadian in revenue. So revenue is growing, and honestly, that's a very good sign that the company is progressing. But okay, let's now talk about Adcore's quarterly numbers. So Adcore's quarterly revenue went up, as we can see here, going from 7 million Canadian in the first quarter of 2025 to the current 8.7 million. So that means that Adcore's revenue went up 23%, which is excellent. However, in terms of gross margin, things are not that good. I mean, gross margin came in at only 36.6%, much lower than what we saw in the first quarter of 2025, when gross margin stood at 44%. Now, the question is, why did that happen? So here's what the company said. Gross margin for the 3 months ended March 31, 2026 were 37% compared to 44% in the same period last year. The decrease in margins is mainly driven by changes in client mix. So okay, gross margin went down because the client mix changed, right? However, honestly, for me, that's too vague. So I will soon interview Omri, Adcore CEO, and well, I will ask him about that, about why gross margin went down. After all, gross margin should be going up since the company is scaling its technology division, its apps. That was the main idea. However, with that said, they expect gross margin to improve and stabilize as the year progresses. So yeah, gross margin went down. However, as they say here, gross margin will likely improve. Now moving on, talking now about operating income, or in this case, operating margin. So operating margin has actually deteriorated, going from negative 3.6% in the first quarter of 2025 to the current negative 7.9%, right? Now, the question again is, why did that happen? So that happened, in my view, mainly because of the lower gross margin we've seen in this quarter. After all, if you think about it, the company is actually improving in terms of operating expenses. I mean, if in the first quarter of 2025, the company was consuming 47.6% of its revenue with its operating expenses, now this number went down to 44.5%. So as we can see here, the company is actually getting more efficient. And well, if that continues and gross margin goes up, well then, the consequence is that over the long run, their bottom line will likely improve if gross margin goes up again. So yeah, operating margin came in lower, but Adcore's operating expenses are actually more controlled. In the end, the problem was the lower gross margin we've seen. And finally, talking now about net income. So, as we can see here, the company ended the quarter with a net loss and with a net margin of negative 8.8%, which was certainly worse than what we saw last year, right? When their net margin came in at negative 2.9%. So in summary, in the end, the key point for me is gross margin. If they keep controlling their operating expenses, I think their bottom line will eventually get positive. So that's why I'm optimistic about Adcore. Now, talking about Adcore's cash generation, as we can see here, Adcore burned 4.7 million Canadian in operating cash flow this quarter. And that happened mainly because of these negative 3.7 million here in change in accounts payable. Now, what does that mean, right? So, these 3.7 million Canadian were subtracted from net income because the company ended up paying several expenses related to the fourth quarter of 2025 during the first quarter of 2026. So that's why cash generation came in weaker than net income. But for me, that's just a seasonality issue. And finally, talking now about Adcore's balance sheet, well, if the company burned cash this quarter, right, it is natural to expect that their net cash position went down, right? And well, that was exactly the case, right? Here we have their net debt position, okay? And well, when this number is negative, as you know, that means that the company holds more cash than debt on its balance sheet. So as we can see here, Adcore's net cash position actually went down from 9.6 million in the end of 2025 to the current 4.4 million in the last quarter, because, as we've seen, the company burned cash. And here they talk a little about that. Yes, I think like a typical year for us, we are starting like, I would say, losing cash a bit because of seasonality. And as the year unfolds, we regain this cash. So, in other words, as the CEO Omnibril is telling us here, yes, their net cash position went down. However, they expect to regain this cash as the year progresses. So honestly, these were the main key points regarding Adcore's Q1 numbers. Okay? Now, with all that said, with all these things considered, what's my opinion about their latest numbers, right? About their latest results. Did I like them? So, I think they were pretty much okay. Revenue is growing. The company seems to be controlling its operating expenses, though they are still posting losses, right? However, in my view, as I mentioned, the main reason for that was the lower gross margin. So if they can fix that, I think Adcore could deliver some positive numbers. That's my opinion. Yes, the company has burned cash. However, I also expect that to change. We had a seasonality issue, right? So things seem to be progressing. That's it for today, and see you next time.